Good evening and welcome to Season 6, Episode 7. Y'all, it's flying by, of The Green Agenda. I'm your host, Kayla, a proud Spelman alumna. And first and foremost, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that this month we are recognizing Disability Pride Month and the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. During these challenging times where diversity and inclusion are being attacked, it is important to be courageous and lead with empathy and love. Before we get too far, also, you all know that I like to take some time to thank our partners who support and make this work possible. Thank you to our partners here at the Environmental Defense Fund, as well as the Climate Action Campaign. Tonight, we are talking about what happens when communities lawyer up. I'm excited. Look, environmental justice is an organizing fight, and it is also a legal fight. Permits, comment periods, zoning votes, and citizen suits are what decide whether a community's objection ends up as a press release or a court order. Tonight's episode, I'm excited to be joined by Amanda Garcia, who is the senior attorney at the Southern Environmental Law Center. Before we get started, Amanda, tell our audience a little bit about yourself and talk about your journey. What brought you here to your current position?
Thanks. That's a great question, Kayla. I'm Amanda Garcia, she, her pronouns, and I have been a lawyer at the Southern Environmental Law Center for over a decade.
So you like it there?
I love it. And I grew up in Southern California in an area where I really loved to be outside, right? The weather is wonderful in Southern California. It's great to wander around in the woods, at the beach, and it has a lot of air pollution. And I was growing up in the 1980s, and there were a lot of days where I could not be outside, where if I went outside, my throat would start hurting. I had a lot of family members with asthma. So I really saw that, like, you know, both the really great benefits of being outdoors and being in the environment and how the actions that we take as a society really are affecting people's ability to enjoy the outdoors and also our health and our well-being. So I kind of knew from an early age that I wanted to work to protect the environment. I didn't know exactly how I wanted to do that, but I settled on law school because I'm pretty good with language, with writing. And even at that point, I didn't necessarily know I wanted to practice law. But when I got out of law school, I clerked for a federal judge, and then I knew I really liked practicing law. But what really motivates me in my work at the Southern Environmental Law Center is actually working with communities on the ground to develop strategies and achieve the goals that they want to see in their community.
I love that. And I love that for so many people, their journey to their career path, it looks different for everyone, right? But so often here on the show, we hear folks talk about their childhood, right? And how closely your childhood and your, local community experiences have an impact on how you decide to show up in the world and how you decide to kind of be the change that you hope to see. And so I'm so excited that your work has called you here. And in the same vein of talking about your journey into being a lawyer, I'm sure you've heard sometimes about the bad rep that lawyers can get, right? Because there's this assumption, right, that all the lawyers are working for the bad guys and, lawyers are deceitful or, there are all of these things that people believe, these preconceived notions that people have about lawyers. So for listeners who make these kinds of assumptions or who assume that lawyers only show up once a lawsuit is filed, what does it actually look like for a lawyer to go alongside community from day one? And what changes when residents are actually setting legal strategy?
So I think the first and foremost, the best community lawyering actually starts well in advance of day one. It evolves over time. You build relationships with community members, and hopefully you're not just jumping in because there's a crisis, but you're building a relationship and learning what the community wants to accomplish and achieve in the bigger picture. Because one thing, I've worked for almost a decade in Memphis, Tennessee, which is how I know Young, Gifted, and Green's wonderful work. And what we've identified is there are individual problems like a proposed crude oil pipeline or an AI data center. But there's also structural problems that require sustained engagement with local decision makers and local bodies like the Land Use Control Board or the local utility board. And so I think the difference in being a community-centered lawyer is that you're not just there for the crisis moments, but you're also there to build power in the community and to help support those longer-term goals of changing the institutions so that they serve the community more effectively. I will also say it's been incredibly liberating for me as a lawyer. I mean, for most professional schools, they train you that you should have all the answers, right? Mm-hmm. Like you come out of it and you think like, oh, I'm going to sweep in.
I can take on the world.
Right. And I need to know everything. And what I've learned from working with people in community in Memphis is that the people most proximate to the problem have the best sense of what the problem actually is and what the solutions are that are going to really help support lasting, meaningful change. And that's liberating because it means that I can stop and listen and learn from people on the ground and then contribute legal tools to a broader strategy that is probably going to involve lots of other pieces like community organizing and political advocacy and all sorts of pieces that maybe are not my strong suit, but I'm working in coalition and collaboration with folks on the ground. So that's been my experience. It's great to work as a community lawyer, both because I guess the other piece about it is, that saying about like, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Mm-hmm. I think if you're just a litigator, it's important to be a litigator and have those tools in your tool belt as a lawyer. But if you're not thinking holistically, then you might default to litigation when a different tool might be more effective for the goals that the community wants to achieve. And so just being on the ground and being able to say like, okay, this particular problem needs us to engage at city council or the Land Use Control Board or anything like that. It opens up the vistas of opportunity. And I'll say that's one of the things I really like about the organization I work for, the Southern Environmental Law Center, because it's place-based. Mm-hmm. And so we do believe that people care about the places that they live and that they want to see change to protect those places and to protect the community that they're part of. And we have attorney boots on the ground in every state where we practice law, which includes Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And so we know we're familiar with the politics, the economic situation, the social dynamics in the different communities that we serve. And I just think it gives us a broader set of tools to draw upon in collaboration with community when we're faced with a challenging problem like a pipeline or a power plant or, as is increasingly the case everywhere, AI data centers.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious. I know we've already gotten a little bit into your story, but considering, right, like the way that you have delved into particularly supporting and litigating on behalf of communities and litigating aside and alongside communities, I'm curious, when you came out of law school, what law you thought you were going to practice? Like, was this always in your mind? Was this like a clearly hammered path? Because oftentimes, like I have a friend that's in law school and I have other friends who have pursued law, and it's kind of like, oh, I'm going into family law, or I'm going into corporate law, or I'm going into, was this a path that felt clearly laid for you, or kind of how did you find your way here?
So I think I knew I wanted to protect the environment. And I also was really drawn to, a lot of the law that you learn about environmental law in law school is federal environmental law.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was in law school, I also took courses in land use law, and I was just really intrigued by like the local and state levels. It seemed like federal law left a lot of questions unanswered, a lot of problems unaddressed. And so after I clerked, I went and practiced law for a kind of a boutique public interest firm in San Francisco that focused primarily on land use and state law. I did do some federal law as well, but I think that just kind of opened up, again, like a broader set of possibilities for providing the community with, tools that are going to actually achieve the outcome that they want. And so early on, I did sort of gravitate toward that path. But really, it wasn't until I moved to the South to Tennessee that I started deeply connecting with the community and looking at problems from like the community lens, and really being in kind of the sort of sustained relationship that I think is a real hallmark of community-centered lawyering, where you're not just there for the big case, you're there for,
for all of it.
For all of it, for helping people figure out like what the deadline is for filing legislation at the city council, or, how to file a public records request, or anything that is going to help support the ultimate goal of, getting a project stopped or building something good in your community, like a more responsive local agency.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love how the work continued to evolve with you. Like, I think that that's incredibly important, that even though you had found a general field, right? But then as you continued to be exposed to the work evolved itself, right? And you followed kind of the trend of not only where your passions went, but also where you saw the need that existed for greater attention. So speaking of, you've mentioned on several occasions, like being with community through all of it. And some of the all of it can include permit applications, agency records, and comment periods, which is where a lot of cases are actually won and lost, right? This can sometimes or oftentimes be the meat of the process. What should residents be reading, requesting, and documenting when a project is first proposed? And how does a community build a record strong enough to hold up in a court later?
So I think there's another feature of community-centered lawyering from my perspective is community self-determination. That's a hallmark of environmental justice. It's one of the 17 principles of environmental justice that were developed in the 1990s. And so I really think like it depends on what the community wants, like what you care about as a community. I know in Memphis where I work, people love the Memphis Sand Aquifer. They want to make sure they have the sweetest drinking water in the world and that it remains that way. And they're very concerned about air pollution because air pollution has been a long-standing problem in Memphis. And so those are kind of the things that when a project gets announced, the first questions are, how much water is it going to use? Where's the water coming from? And then where is the power coming from? Or what are the the air pollution implications of this project? But it could be different for each community. And then, so once you kind of settle on these are our priorities, then you just, we start asking questions everywhere. And I'll give an example of when XAI, the AI data center company that's run by Elon Musk, when they announced that they were coming to Memphis, it was immediately, because we had been working in coalition on a range of issues, several groups across the community, we knew to ask these questions about where is the water coming from? Where is the power coming from? And then we asked questions in every way and sought answers in every way we could possibly do it. So, we showed up at local elected officials, city council meetings. We showed up at the local utility board meetings and just started asking questions. We also submitted a lot of public records requests and just tried to get a sense of what was going on, what had already been agreed to. We didn't know exactly what the best avenue for getting a seat at the table would be at first. So we were really proceeding along multiple paths, talking to the folks who we thought would be in charge of the decisions about water, the folks we thought would be in charge of the decisions about power. And then we were, surprised to find that XAI built a bunch of unpermitted turbines without any pollution controls. And that really became one of the primary focuses of the campaign. And from that point forward, we were focused on that, and we were focused on trying to reduce the impacts on the Memphis Sand Aquifer. And those two have really been sort of the touchstones of that XAI campaign that we've been involved in for the past 2 years in Memphis. So it's addressing the air pollution impacts and the water use of the facility. And again, driven by those community values of we want to protect our water and we want to protect our air. And those are the, I think I may not have answered your whole question, but that's...
No, I think that you did. I am curious though. So for our folks, our listeners that may be at home who aren't connected to a lawyer or maybe just aren't familiar with the legal process, right? But they know their community, they're familiar with the issues, they're familiar with the priorities. How do they begin the process of is their first step to find a local lawyer? Is there power that they can lean on if maybe they can't afford a lawyer or they're not familiar with resources that could support them to find a lawyer who may be available for free or low cost? How can folks continue to organize and go through due processes if maybe they are just unfamiliar with some of the legal jargon or those processes?
Right. That's a great question. So, there's a lot of information. Usually, data centers are a special case where there's a real lack of transparency around the proposals. But usually there's a fair amount of information provided by some regulatory agency about whatever project is going to be proposed. So a lot of community members in Memphis track the Land Use Control Board pretty closely because they'll have staff reports that talk about, what the potential development is going to look like that's down the street from where you live, right? And so just reading through those kinds of documents, which if you have access to the internet, that stuff is pretty available online in a lot of cases. Sometimes you have to actually go and show up at the land use or the Office of Planning and Development in your community. Not all of them have the sophisticated online portals and things like that. So sometimes you do have to just show up and ask for the papers, ask for the plans. And you don't need to be an expert to look at that stuff and kind of start to figure out okay, this is going to have a bunch of big machinery. What is it going to be noisy? Is it going to create pollution? What are the issues I should be concerned about? And once you know what the thing is, then you can go do a little bit of research on what are the types of impacts that I might expect to see. And there's a lot of environmental organizations out there that have information about particular types of projects. So I know at SELC, we have a fact sheet that kind of walks through, here are the types of impacts you might see from an AI data center.
Yeah.
And then you've got your kind of toolkit, and you just I don't have to be the expert. As a community member, you're the expert in how things are going to potentially affect you. You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to know enough to ask the right questions. You definitely don't need a lawyer for that.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note, right? Like, understanding sometimes the gap is not necessarily like a lack of desire or even a lack of knowledge, but not necessarily having familiarity with what the systems and the avenues. And so it is important to familiarize yourself with your local regulatory agencies to know whether or not you have to show up or whether information is available online, to be aware of the city council agenda items that are coming up for ongoing meetings, right?
But Kayla, I want to be real. Like, people have a lot going on. Like, they're working, they're taking care of kids. There's a lot of pressures on community members, and like, you don't have to bear it alone, right? I mean, one of the reasons that organizations like Young, Gifted, and Green exist is to help people kind of filter through that information and navigate and find the opportunities. Like, if you care about clean water, here's the set of opportunities. So one thing that I definitely recommend for folks is just to get involved with a local advocacy organization, whether it's Young, Gifted, and Green or NAACP, you know, all of these local community organizations. If they're focused on advocacy at all, they're going to be great sources of information and will help you navigate and kind of identify, you know, what are the biggest issues that you want to focus on.
Yeah, because realistically, it can be a lot.
Yeah.
Realistically, the amount of information that comes at everyone on a daily basis is like exorbitant, right? But being thoughtful, as you said, about like the local resource networks, right? And being available, the best ability is availability, they say, right? So like, how can you make yourself available even if you don't have all the answers, even if you don't understand all the systems, even if you don't have a lawyer yet, right? But if you see something that is impacting your community and you feel like, you know, you have the energy or the capacity to contribute to a solution, right? Making yourself available to the organization standing at the forefront of that fight could really make a difference, right? Because you never know what could happen if you put your hands to an issue, right?
Yeah. I will say, like, I think a lot about, in really difficult times like this one, like what brings me joy. And the thing that brings me joy is being at meetings of whether it's city council or an air permitting agency, and just seeing the groundswell of participation, small d democratic participation by community members, sharing their story, sharing their perspective, sharing their concerns, and asking more and better of the people who are supposed to be working to protect our clean air, our clean water, the things that we care about, the basic rights. Yeah. And that's just, it's incredibly powerful. From my perspective, like much more so than, you know, when I stand up and make a legal argument, but seeing that kind of groundswell of people on the ground really engaging in the small d democratic process, it gives me a lot of hope for the future of our country and of the environmental movement.
Yeah. Well, speaking of those basic rights, we have bedrock laws like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act that give ordinary people the right to take a polluter to court themselves when regulators will not act and industry refuses to uphold the law. Break down what a citizen suit actually is and why it is so important now more than ever for every frontline community to understand how it all works.
Citizen suits are an incredible tool that when Congress passed laws, the foundational environmental laws in the 1970s, they really wanted those laws to protect people's health, right? I mean, they're just like we are now. There was a lot of pollution. There was a lot of just industrial sources that were polluting in ways that were harming communities. And it's just a matter of government resources that they're not, that the folks who would work for the federal EPA or your state agency, they're not going to be able to take on every case that's causing where a polluter is causing harm to a community. So Congress put another protective avenue in there where citizens can, as long as they are harmed in some way, by the pollution, they can send what's called a notice of intent to sue. They have to also send it to the government as a hey, we're worried about this. If y'all aren't going to do something, we are going to sue this polluter.
This is which government? Their state government?
They have to send notice to both the state and the federal government, because both have the ability to also hold the polluter accountable. But in many cases, they don't, either because they just have limited resources or for whatever reason. And so if the government doesn't step in, when you send that notice letter, then you can file a complaint in federal court for the federal environmental laws, and you can try to hold the polluter accountable and get, injunctive relief, some sort of remedy that reduces the pollution and requires them to comply with the law. So it's a really powerful tool for communities. And I think it's even more so now when we're seeing a lack of willingness on the part of the federal EPA to enforce our bedrock environmental laws. And in many cases, especially in the South where I work, we're seeing, sort of reduced resources for government holding corporate actors accountable as well. And so it really does provide an avenue for communities to take action and make sure that their health is protected to the degree that it is required to be by law. The one thing I'll say, though, about citizen suits is they're very resource intensive, and they're resource intensive for lawyers, but they're also resource intensive for the the community organization and its members who might be involved. So it's not a decision that communities usually take on lightly, particularly because a lot of times the polluter is also an employer in the town and things like that. So it's an important tool, and it's also one that, we use when nothing else is working to hold that polluter accountable, or to get them to do what they are supposed to do to protect public health.
Yeah. So then the citizen suit is kind of like a final resort to a certain extent, right? This is if I've gone through due process of existing government systems. Right. I have done everything. We've sat in on the meetings, we've organized, we've petitioned, we've done everything that we could possibly think of. The citizen suit is then a last ditch resort to attempt to force them to comply to honoring the basic rights of the local community. Is that correct?
That's how I think about it. Yeah. I mean, I think it's available, but it's usually communities would choose to do that only after they have tried a lot of other ways of approaching the problem with the company directly, or with state and federal agencies that are charged with protecting public health. So yeah, and it is at the same time, it can be a really powerful tool to accomplish those goals. I think earlier we were talking about, how do you choose what to focus on? And it's got to be what the community cares about. And then you can look at the citizen suit. In some cases, it may be the only way to get the result that you want to get. But it's a very important tool, and unfortunately, it is under attack right now. Particularly the federal government is working to try to undermine the use of citizen suits, which is, it's especially concerning given that the government itself is not
protecting
the basic rights that folks have that are part of our laws,
right.
and have been for 50 years now.
Yeah. And it's important to know what those rights are, right? Like, it's important that you be aware that a citizen suit is not a right that first of all, it's not recent. Right. Like, that this is something that has existed for a very long time, that it was baked into the foundation of our democracy, that it's incredibly important as a safeguard and a check and balance to government systems, and the increasingly fine line that our government systems are towing with industry, right? Like, in allowing industry leaders to, in some way, seemingly make decisions about how government will function, right? By the way that they allow them to get away with things, by the way they allow them to overstep their bounds. There are quite a few intended checks and balances that currently feel like they are at risk and under attack by our federal government, which is extremely concerning. And I would say something extremely important to keep in mind as we head into midterm season. Okay. But before I get too far into that, I want to take us to our next question. So, federal court, state permit hearings, air pollution control boards, utility commissions, planning commissions, city council, all of these rooms have their own rules. Okay. And that's just to begin to name a few. That's not an exhaustive list, of course. All of them have their own rules, their own timelines, remedies, and most people have never even heard of half of them or understand how they function. How should a community group decide where to put its energy, and what does a real win look like in some of those rooms?
So that is, the crucial question, right? Like, we all have limited time and resources, and how do you figure out where to do your advocacy and where to focus? And again, I would point back to that community self-determination, the goals that you want to achieve, and then looking at what in law, we call it the remedy, right? Like, what can that particular actor or agency do for you?
Yeah.
Like, how does it advance that goal, or does it advance that goal? So, you could have the goal of getting clean energy for your community, right? And so then you've got to look at who has the power
to get clean energy.
And it's hopefully going to be more than one place that can help. Certainly, like, you can, pass laws, but also, like, maybe your utility would be willing to do a clean energy project, and you could go and advocate for that with them, even without having to change the law. So there are usually multiple avenues, but you've got to and this is, again, where that sustained local engagement is really important, because not only do you know what's, like, on paper in terms of, like, okay, this agency has the authority to do this agency has the authority to do that, but you also start to get a sense of, like, will they, though?
Yeah.
Like, who are the personalities there? What's the institutional culture?
Yeah.
Like, and if
what folks do you have in your corner?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's a fair amount of power mapping that goes on, in trying to figure out what the right solution is. And then you asked about like, what does a win look like? This is where I really feel like, the law, you can get a court order, you can win on the law, but if you aren't changing hearts and minds, it's going to be a temporary win. Solution. And so that's part of why I really love working with community, because you're building people power, you're shifting the story of your community, you're shifting the focus, you're bringing more perspectives in and helping your elected leaders and your agency officials make better decisions. Sometimes we get thanked by local agencies for being a counterweight to the industrial voices in the room or in the community. Yeah. I'm not saying that happens super often, but when it does,
it's exciting.
Usually they're just like, you're making more work for us.
But hey, sometimes the work is the good work.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Sometimes a little extra work is necessary. No, I really appreciate that, right? Especially the first point that really stuck out to me is in talking about the plethora of ways that you can approach attacking an issue, right? And understanding that getting a no from city council isn't always a final answer, right? Or that, because sometimes we can be discouraged when we try to operate through systems, not understanding that there are several entities that are connected to each and every issue, right? And so sometimes there's a back door, or sometimes there's a side door, or sometimes there's a window, right? Sometimes there are other avenues that you can take. And as you familiarize yourself with your local entities or that local culture, but then also, as you said, going back, being connected to organizations that already understand and have navigated some of those pathways, because oftentimes, unfortunately, when you, as a citizen or a resident, coming up against an entity, sometimes you're taken less seriously. Unfortunately, that's just the fact of the matter, right? That if you are approaching an entity with a desire for a solution or a desire for a change, and it requires large scale movement, right? It requires for them to go back to the drawing board. As an individual, you are not always taken as seriously, or the level of accountability is not the same as if you come with more members of your community or you come with institutional support behind you, right? Which is where having a local advocacy organization in your corner comes in handy, right? Or having a lawyer, or having, right? And so it's also important that we be thoughtful of coalition building, right? Like, how can we truly organize and mobilize people around an issue? Whereas sometimes I feel in our, like, the current state of activism, right, is trying to figure out what I can do as quickly as possible with as little resistance as possible, right? Not understanding that, as we've stated previously, as we stated previously, a lot of this work is happening behind the scenes, right? A lot of the greatest changes that we've seen, changes in civil rights, changes in environmental rights, changes have taken years and years of talking behind the scenes, of having conversations, of finding every open window, avenue, door, trying to figure out and map the systems. Something else that really stuck out to me as you were speaking was in thinking about, oh my goodness, you said that sometimes you get thanked because you're offering an opposite counterweight to. Sometimes we assume that without our voices in the room that somebody else will say it. Right? Like, sometimes we assume, like, everybody knows that someone will step up to the plate, right? Or we assume that that without us moving, that the needle will continue to move forward or on an issue, or that it won't move any further back. And as we've been discussing lately, first of all, it is an incredibly clear that now more than ever that our government systems have some audacity. Okay? It is clear now more than ever, first of all, that the audacity is at an all-time high, and the complacency is also at an all-time high. And so we have to take it upon ourselves to step up to the plate, right? To be the counterweight, to be the squeaky wheel, to be the only person that's speaking truth to power, or not even that we're always the only person, but sometimes you may be, right? Realistically.
At least at first.
Yeah.
So I recently had the opportunity to visit the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice in Durham, North Carolina. And they were a incredible force in the civil rights movement. And they had this quote, I actually got the mug, that said, one person plus one typewriter equals a movement. Like just one person starting. Pauli Murray was really big on questioning, binaries of all sorts, poor and rich, black and white, male and female, like all of that. And, just starting out with like, I'm asking these questions. Surely other people have these questions too.
Yeah.
And so I do think you're exactly right. And like being in relation, like showing up in person, being very present, I think is really important because you are just going to be listened to more if you're there in person.
If they know your face when you show up.
At the other side of the spectrum, you have an example I'll give of that is actually from early on in the Byhalia pipeline crude oil fight. A person who showed up and just shared his perspective was Justin J. Pearson, who went on to found Memphis Community Against Pollution and now is a state representative in Tennessee. And, he stood up at a community meeting and shared his perspective about the fact that the pipeline company had called his community the path of least resistance. And that he moved enough people who were there in person that they kind of approached him and said, hey, let's do something about this. And that was kind of the moment of, reinvigorating the environmental justice advocacy on the ground around this pipeline project in Memphis. And I still have in my that our coalition that we regularly work with, that Young, Gifted, and Green is part of, came out of that Byhalia pipeline fight. And one of the things I love about it is that you honor everybody's gifts. Everybody has different gifts and everybody has something to bring to the table. So I'm a lawyer, right? I can bring the legal tools to the table, but I also know that Young, Gifted, and Green is going to bring the strategic thinking, is going to bring the community perspective. There are really talented organizers who are part of the coalition. So there's just a whole range of gifts that are part of it. And I have this poster in my office that is, in 2021, Memphis defeated a pipeline. And it says, thank you to our lawyers, our community activists, our reporters, our artists, our spokespeople, our like all the different roles that it takes to really develop a movement. And I will say that it's way more fun to do it with all these different people rather than, just me standing up in court or me on my typewriter. It's just way more fun.
Yeah, you never know what'll spark. Yeah. Well, speaking of you standing in a court or sitting in an office, litigation can be expensive and slow. And not every community has a law center in its corner. So beyond the courtroom, what does community-centered governance and no-go decision-making actually look like on the ground?
So there is so much impact that you can make without having without having the legal component to it. I mean, we've been talking about just the power of showing up, of starting to ask questions. You can intuit when something is not right, right? And just starting to ask questions about like why it is that way. A great example in Memphis recently was they were requiring people to give their home addresses, you know, in public at meetings in order to speak. And in this day and age, that's not a good idea.
To give an address in this public setting.
And so, you know, folks just started raising questions about it as they were speaking. And it has gotten the attention, and there have been some changes in some of the policies of the local agencies.
Like, I could say my zip code. Like,
right,
geez.
exactly. Why do you need my like precise home address? It's an intimidation factor and a way of deterring people from speaking publicly. So those kinds of changes of just like showing up and asking questions about whether it's a project or a policy or anything like that. And again, like working with community advocacy groups that maybe already exist. If one doesn't exist that addresses the concern that you have, maybe that's your calling. You know?
Yeah.
We've seen that. We now have an organization in Memphis that is focused on trying to modernize the local utility, you know, and it's just an outgrowth of some community members who were tired of the meters not reading their bills right. And that's now they are very interested in just accountability for that particular agency in particular.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's not an issue specific. Sometimes we have like a whole ecosystem in Memphis of neighborhood groups, right? And they can decide, okay, these are our values and we want to pursue a particular issue. The thing that I think is important is developing, if you're trying to make change, there's got to be leverage in there somehow. So if you don't have the legal leverage, where you got to think about where is your leverage coming from? It could be people power. It could be like the showing up. It could be media and communications. It could be, political power. You just kind of have to figure out like what space can we hold. And a lot of times the other forms of leverage will come along once you start.
As you build.
Yeah, as you build. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't have to start with everything.
Right.
That's really great. And just like that, we're coming close to the close of our episode. And I feel like there's so much that we've been able to touch on. And I really appreciate you lending light from a lawyer's perspective, not just on the work in the litigation, but everything that comes behind, underneath, above, and around that, right? When you're working alongside community, especially in an area that is directly under attack by our federal government. And so as we prepare to head close to the close of another episode, I'm curious if our audience hasn't heard anything else. And I always say, I hope that they've heard everything else, right? Because you've dropped a lot of gems for us, particularly in looking from the, I feel like I'm watching one of those episodes of How It's Made, right? But if they haven't heard anything else, what is one thing that you would like for our audience to hear, for them to leave feeling emboldened and prepared to take on work in their community?
I think it is just get your feet wet, get out there, attend a city council meeting, attend a land use control board meeting. You don't have to do it alone. You can go and get involved with a local organization like Young, Gifted, and Green or NAACP, or you can just show up on your own and just start to get a sense of like how things are working. I just think that understanding, we hear so much on the news about how our democracy is broken, right? And how things are not going well. But if you get in there and really work at the local level, you can make meaningful change. And it starts with just showing up.
That's good, because democracy works when we do.
Yes.
And the biggest thing that breaks a democracy, because let's be real, in the country of America, although we just celebrated 250 years, for all 250 years, there have been challenges to our democracy. There were challenges at the foundation. Yeah. There were challenges when we began. There were ways that systems were built in order to inherently block certain people out and make it exclusive, right? Yeah. So democracy has always had its flaws. And in every iteration of this 250 years and all of the flaws of our democracy, what has made the difference is when people showed up.
Yes.
And so I would almost argue that our democracy is no more broken today than it's ever been before, right? But the greatest difference is made when we give up, because a democracy doesn't function the same when we are not acting as the electorate, right? The greatest indicator of a democracy is in its electorate and not in its leadership. And so when we as the people of America stand up and say, this is unacceptable, this I will stand for, this I will not, then that's what mends the cracks in it. And I'm sure we'll be continuing to build and mend our democracy for years to come. Absolutely. But that is the work of a democracy, right? Yeah. Is continuing to show up as the people. It's
not a static thing. You're always shaping it in different ways. And as a lawyer, of course, I think one of the ways that we can engage is by insisting on the rule of law, right? Mm-hmm. And you can do that at the local level too. If you see something that isn't right, look at your code and, show up at city council and say, hey, this doesn't seem to be going the way it's supposed to according to our law, and just see what happens. You can get, you've got to demand accountability.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of what we do and is what I do. And it is also very accessible to community members who don't have law degrees. You can demand that your local leaders hold themselves accountable and hold polluters accountable. And that is absolutely essential to our health and well-being as individuals, as communities, and as a democracy.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for an episode. Thank you all so much for joining us for another episode of The Green Agenda. We'll catch you right back here next month. Bye.